I was 25 years old when my mother found the birth control pills in my purse. I remember the exact moment because everything that came after felt like watching my life shatter in slow motion, each piece falling and breaking into smaller fragments until nothing remained of the daughter I used to be. She had asked to borrow my phone charger, and I told her it was in my bag on the kitchen counter. I was in the shower, water running hot against my skin, thinking about the dinner plans James and I had made for that evening. I didn't hear her go through my things. I didn't hear the sharp intake of breath when she found the small pink compact tucked in the side pocket. I only heard the pounding on the bathroom door, so violent I thought the hinges would give way, and my father's voice booming through the wood, calling me a whore in a language I'd spoken since birth, but had never heard wielded like a weapon until that moment. When I emerged, wrapped in a towel and dripping water onto the hallway carpet, both my parents stood there with faces I'd never seen before. My mother held the pill pack between two fingers like it was contaminated. Touching it fully might transfer my sin onto her skin. My father's hands were clenched at his sides, knuckles white, jaw working in that way that meant he was trying to control his rage, but losing the battle. I opened my mouth to explain, though what explanation could possibly satisfy them I didn't know. Before I could form words, my mother threw the pills at my feet and said in a voice colder than I'd ever heard from her that no daughter of hers would desecrate her body this way, that I had invited demons into their home, that I was corrupting the sanctity of their household with my modern wickedness. I tried to tell them I was an adult, that James and I were planning our future, that we were being responsible. My father's hand connected with my cheek before I finished the sentence, the slap echoing through the house we'd lived in for 15 years, the house where I'd celebrated birthdays and graduations and every milestone of my youth. The physical pain was sharp, but brief. What lasted was the look in his eyes afterward. Not shock at what he'd done, but conviction. Righteous certainty that he'd been justified. My mother stood behind him nodding, tears streaming down her face but her expression hard as stone. She told me I had 30 minutes to pack whatever I could carry and leave their house, that I was no longer welcome under their roof, that I had chosen the world over God, and now I would face the consequences of that choice. I stood there shaking, water from my hair dripping onto my shoulders, my cheek burning, trying to understand how 25 years of being their daughter had evaporated in the time it took to find a prescription medication. James wasn't supposed to pick me up for another 3 hours. I didn't have my own apartment yet because I'd been saving money while living at home, planning to move in with him in 2 months when our lease started. In 30 minutes, I had to pack a life and figure out where it would continue. I called James from my bedroom with the door locked, my voice barely above a whisper because I could hear my parents in the hallway talking in rapid, angry tones about my transgression. He didn't ask questions, just said he'd be there in 20 minutes and to pack the important things. We'd figure out the rest later. I grabbed clothes, documents, my laptop, photos of my grandmother who died when I was 12, and who I knew would have taken my side in this. I could hear my mother calling relatives, her voice carrying through the walls, telling them what I'd done, asking for prayers, spinning a narrative I knew would spread through our entire community before sunset. When James's car pulled up outside, my father opened my bedroom door without knocking and told me I had 5 minutes now, not 30, because my presence was poisoning their home with every breath I took. I dragged 2 suitcases down the stairs, my mother standing at the bottom with her arms crossed, watching me struggle with the weight but not offering to help, her face a mask of disappointment and disgust I'd never seen directed at me before. James helped me load everything into his trunk, his jaw tight with controlled anger, not saying a word to my parents, though I could see he wanted to. My father stood on the porch and said loudly enough for the neighbors to hear that I was dead to them now, that I had chosen damnation, that they would pray for my soul, but I was no longer their daughter. My mother's voice joined his, shriller, saying I would understand one day when I had children of my own what it meant to watch your child destroy themselves, how much pain I was causing them by rejecting their guidance and God's law. I got in the car and didn't look back as James pulled away from the curb, though I could see in the side mirror that they stood there watching until we turned the corner. I thought that would be the end of it, that they'd meant what they said about cutting ties, that at least there would be the mercy of clean separation. I didn't understand yet that for people like my parents, exile wasn't enough. They needed to bring me back into the fold or make sure I suffered enough to serve as a warning to others. The next 3 years were a masterclass in emotional warfare disguised as concerned parenting. James and I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment across town, and I started working double shifts at the hospital where I'd just completed my nursing certification. My parents had cut me off financially, which I'd expected, but they'd also called every member of our extended family to explain why, painting me as a rebellious daughter who'd abandoned her faith and her family for a man who was leading me astray. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from aunts and uncles and cousins I barely knew, all telling me I needed to repent, to leave James, to come home and beg forgiveness. My mother's sister showed up at my workplace twice in the first month, causing scenes in the hospital lobby, demanding to speak to me about my soul, telling my coworkers I was brainwashed and needed intervention. I had to get security to escort her out the second time when she wouldn't leave, and started accusing James of being abusive, saying he must have forced me to take birth control, that their sweet niece would never make such choices on her own. 6 months after they threw me out, my father had a minor heart scare, nothing serious but enough to require an overnight hospital stay for observation. My mother called me for the first time since that terrible day, her voice tight and formal, saying that despite my sins, I should know my father was in the hospital, and it was my duty as a daughter to visit him. I went because part of me still hoped this might be a bridge back to some kind of relationship. That fear of mortality might have softened their stance. My father was sitting up in bed watching television when I arrived, looking healthier than I'd seen him in years, certainly not like a man at death's door. When I approached his bedside, he didn't acknowledge me at first, kept his eyes on the screen like I wasn't there. My mother sat in the corner chair, and after a long silence said they'd been talking to their pastor about my situation, that there was a path back to the family if I was willing to take it. The terms were simple, she explained in a voice that made it clear they weren't negotiable. End my relationship with James, move back home, undergo counseling with their church to address my rebellious spirit, and commit to a life that honored God's design for women. I felt something inside me that had still been holding on to hope finally release and fall away. I looked at my father, who was now looking at me with expectant eyes, as if he genuinely believed I would agree to erase 3 years of my life and the person I'd become. I told them no as calmly as I could manage, that I loved James, that we were building a good life together, that I'd found a faith community that accepted me as I was rather than demanding I break myself to fit their mold. My mother's face contorted with rage, and she launched into a tirade about how I was spitting in God's face, how I'd regret this when I was burning in hell, how every moment of happiness I thought I had with James was actually a deception from Satan preparing me for eternal torment. A nurse came in to check my father's vitals and asked if everything was okay, because my mother's voice had risen loud enough to disturb other patients. I left before they could say anything else, and as I walked out, I heard my mother tell the nurse that I was their estranged daughter who'd fallen into a cult. Could she believe the disrespect, coming to their time of crisis only to cause more pain? James proposed to me 3 months later in the tiny apartment we'd made into a home. No fancy restaurant or public spectacle. Just him kneeling in our living room with a ring he'd been saving for and asking me to build a life with him officially. I said yes without hesitation. And for the first time since that day with the birth control pills, I felt something like pure joy untainted by the shadow of my parents' judgment. We planned a small wedding, just close friends and James's family who'd welcomed me with open arms, despite the dramatic circumstances of how James and I had ended up living together so suddenly. I didn't send my parents an invitation because I didn't imagine they'd come. Couldn't imagine standing at an altar and pledging my life to James while they sat in the pews, radiating disapproval. I told my grandmother's sister, Aunt Marie, who'd stayed in touch with me secretly despite family pressure, and she promised to come and to keep it quiet from the rest of the family. The wedding was beautiful and small and everything I wanted. 30 people who genuinely celebrated our union. No drama, no speeches about sin. Just love and support and hope for our future together. My mother found out about the wedding 2 weeks after it happened through a mutual friend who'd seen photos on social media. She called me from a number I didn't recognize, so I answered thinking it might be work-related. Her voice was shaking with rage when she spoke, demanding to know if it was true that I'd gotten married without telling them, without inviting my own parents to witness their only daughter's wedding. I tried to explain calmly that given everything that had happened, I hadn't thought they'd want to attend, that I'd been trying to avoid causing them pain by not forcing them to choose between their principles and their daughter. She cut me off mid-sentence and said something I'll never forget, her voice dropping to a cold whisper that was somehow more terrifying than her screaming. She said that I had made an enemy of my own mother, that I would understand one day when I had children what it meant to be excluded from their lives, that she would pray every day for God to show me the pain I'd caused by making me experience it myself. Then she hung up, and I stood there in my kitchen holding the phone with hands that had gone numb, trying to process the fact that my mother had just cursed me with the very thing that would later become my reality. The harassment intensified after the wedding news spread through the family. My parents launched what I can only describe as a campaign to destroy my marriage and my reputation within our community. They told everyone who would listen that James had manipulated me, isolated me from my family, probably abused me behind closed doors because why else would a good daughter turn so completely against her parents? They showed up at James's workplace claiming they needed to speak to him about their daughter's safety, causing enough of a scene that his boss had to get involved. They contacted my nursing supervisor with concerns about my mental stability, suggesting I might be using drugs because my personality had changed so drastically, wondering aloud if I should be trusted with patient care. Each incident required explanations, defenses, proof that I was fine and my parents were the ones behaving erratically. It was exhausting and humiliating, and there were moments I wondered if it would be easier to just give in, to let them win, to trade my happiness for peace. James would find me crying on those days and remind me that peace bought with surrender wasn't really peace at all, just a different kind of prison. 2 years into our marriage, things finally seemed to settle into a quieter pattern. My parents still hadn't accepted our relationship, but the active harassment had decreased to occasional guilt-laden emails from my mother and messages forwarded through relatives about how much pain I was causing. James and I had built a good life despite everything, both advancing in our careers, saving money, talking seriously about starting a family. We'd found a church community that felt like the family I'd lost, people who knew our story and supported us without judgment, who celebrated our anniversaries and invited us to their homes and treated our love as the legitimate, sacred thing it was. I started to believe that maybe we'd weathered the worst of it, that time and distance had finally created the boundaries we needed. I let myself imagine a future where my parents were simply absent, a sad reality, but one I'd learned to accept, rather than the active threat they'd been for so long. That illusion shattered when I got pregnant at 33. James and I had been trying for about 6 months, had just started to wonder if we'd need help, when the test came back positive. The joy was immediate and overwhelming, both of us crying in the bathroom at 6 a.m, already planning nursery colors and baby names and all the ways we'd love this child. But underneath the joy was a current of grief I hadn't expected, a sudden sharp longing for my mother that took me by surprise. I found myself wanting to call her, to share this news, to hear her voice soften the way I remembered it doing when I was small, and brought her a good grade or a drawing I'd made. James saw it on my face and asked gently if I wanted to reach out to them, said he'd support whatever I decided. I thought about it for days, weighing the possibility of reconciliation against the certainty of more pain, trying to imagine my mother holding my baby with the same hands that had thrown me out of her house. I decided to tell them through Aunt Marie, who'd maintained her quiet contact with me over the years despite family pressure. I asked her to let my parents know they'd be grandparents, that if they wanted to be part of this child's life, they'd need to respect my marriage and my choices, but that the door was open if they could do that. Aunt Marie called me back 3 days later, sounding exhausted and sad. She said my mother had cried when she heard the news, had clutched her rosary and thanked God for this blessing, but then in the next breath had said this was proof that God was giving me a chance to return to the family. that surely now I'd see the importance of raising a child in a proper household with proper guidance. My father had been even more direct, telling Aunt Marie to relay that they'd be happy to welcome their grandchild, but not the man who'd corrupted their daughter. That if I wanted them in my baby's life, I'd need to leave James and come home where a child should be raised. The conditions hadn't changed at all, just found a new hostage to attach themselves to. I cried for hours after that phone call, hormones and grief combining into a storm of emotion I couldn't control. James held me and let me soak his shirt with tears, and didn't say anything because what was there to say that would make it better? I'd hoped, despite knowing better, that a grandchild would be the thing that finally broke through their rigidity, that love for an innocent baby would override their need to control me. Instead, they'd just found a new weapon, a new way to suggest that my choices were harming someone other than myself. I could already hear the arguments they'd make to family members, to mutual acquaintances, maybe even to authorities if they got desperate enough. Poor child being raised by a mother who abandoned her faith, a father they'd never accepted. Imagine the confusion and pain that baby would experience without proper grandparents to provide stability and guidance. The pregnancy that should have been pure joy became tainted with anxiety about what battles were coming, what new forms their campaign would take now that there was a baby involved. The last months of pregnancy were physically difficult, complications that put me on bed rest for 6 weeks before delivery, but emotionally they were even harder. My mother sent cards addressed only to me, never acknowledging James, filled with Bible verses about children being blessings and parents needing to guide them properly. She sent baby clothes in colors she'd chosen, traditional outfits from our culture that came with notes about heritage and tradition, and making sure the baby knew where they came from. Each package felt like a colonization attempt, like she was trying to claim this child before they were even born, to establish her vision of who they'd be regardless of what James and I wanted. I stopped opening them after a while, just stacked them in a closet unopened, unable to throw them away, but equally unable to engage with what they represented. James suggested we move, get a different address, cut off even this passive form of contact, but I couldn't quite bring myself to do it yet, some part of me still holding on to the fantasy that they'd change. My son was born on a Tuesday in March after 22 hours of labor that ended in an emergency cesarean. They placed him on my chest in the recovery room, this tiny, perfect being who had my nose and James's eyes and lungs that announced his arrival with impressive volume. James was crying. I was crying. The nurse was smiling at us like we'd just performed a miracle, which in a way I suppose we had. In that moment, holding my son for the first time, I felt a clarity I'd never experienced before. I understood with absolute certainty that I would never, ever allow my parents to treat this child the way they'd treated me. I would never let him grow up watching his mother be diminished and controlled, would never let him think that love came with conditions and punishments, would never let him believe that family meant accepting abuse in the name of tradition. The door I'd left slightly ajar in my heart finally closed completely, and I felt lighter for it despite the grief that came with the closing. We named him Lucas James, and we didn't tell my parents for 2 weeks. We wanted time to exist in our bubble, just the 3 of us learning each other, before the outside world intruded with its demands and expectations. James's parents came to visit and were wonderful, gentle and helpful, and appropriately emotional about their first grandchild. Our church friends brought meals and gifts and offered to help with anything we needed. We posted photos on social media for our chosen family to see. This beautiful baby who was loved and wanted and safe. I should have known my mother would find them despite me having blocked her on every platform years ago. She had ways, networks of relatives and acquaintances who still fed her information about my life. And within 3 days of me posting the first photo, my phone started ringing from unknown numbers I quickly learned not to answer. The messages started arriving through every possible channel. Email, text from numbers I didn't recognize, voicemails that ranged from tearful pleading to angry demands. My mother's voice saying she had a right to meet her grandson, that I was being cruel keeping him from her, that blood meant something whether I wanted to acknowledge it or not. My father's voice, harder and colder, saying I was repeating the sins of my rebellious youth by denying my child his heritage and his family, that God would judge me for this selfishness. Relatives I'd barely spoken to in a decade suddenly had opinions about my parenting choices, messages asking how I could be so heartless. Didn't I know my parents were suffering? Didn't I understand that family was forever regardless of disagreements? The word disagreements made me want to scream every time I saw it, as if being assaulted and disowned and harassed for years was just a simple difference of opinion we should be able to move past. Aunt Marie called me crying, begging me to reconsider, saying my mother was making herself sick with grief over not being able to see the baby. She said my mother sat in what used to be my childhood bedroom, holding the baby clothes she'd sent, praying and weeping, imagining holding a grandchild she'd never met. I felt a flicker of sympathy quickly extinguished by anger at the manipulation of it all. Where was this grief when they were throwing me out of the house? Where was this desperate love when they were calling my workplace to question my mental stability? Where was this family devotion when they were demanding I leave my husband as the price of their acceptance? I told Aunt Marie as gently as I could that my mother's grief was a consequence of her own choices, that I'd offered them a chance to be part of Lucas's life on reasonable terms, and they'd refused, that I wasn't going to sacrifice my son's well-being on the altar of their conditional love. Aunt Marie went quiet for a long moment, and then said something that chilled me. She said my mother had been talking to people at their church about grandparents' rights, about legal options for forcing visitation, that I should be prepared because my mother wasn't going to let this go. I spent the next week in a state of controlled panic, researching grandparents' rights laws in our state, consulting with a family lawyer, documenting every threatening message and every instance of harassment over the past 8 years. The lawyer, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, told me that grandparents' rights were difficult to enforce in cases where both parents were fit and married and opposed to visitation, but that it could still be a lengthy and expensive court battle if my parents chose to pursue it. She advised me to keep documenting everything, to never leave Lucas alone with anyone who might facilitate contact with my parents without my permission, to be prepared for them to escalate now that legal threats were on the table. I left her office feeling like I'd stepped into a nightmare version of parenthood where instead of worrying about normal things like sleep schedules and developmental milestones, I was planning legal defense strategies against my own parents. James found me that night sitting in Lucas's nursery, watching our son sleep in his crib with tears streaming down my face. He sat next to me on the floor and took my hand and asked what I was thinking. I told him I was thinking about all the moments my parents would miss because they couldn't let go of their need to control me. First steps and first words and birthday parties and school plays and every precious thing that makes up a childhood. I told him I was thinking about how Lucas would grow up knowing he had grandparents who existed, but chose conditions over connection, and how I'd have to explain that to him someday in a way that didn't make him feel like he was missing something essential. I told him I was angry and sad and tired and so fucking done with having to defend my right to protect my own child. James pulled me close and said that Lucas would never doubt he was loved because he'd have us and James's parents and our chosen family, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give a child is showing them that it's okay to walk away from toxicity, even when it wears the face of family. The legal threat never materialized into actual papers being served, but the pressure campaign continued at a lower, more insidious level. My parents started sending gifts for Lucas through relatives, expensive items that came with cards signed, "From Grandma and Grandpa who love you even though Mommy won't let us meet you." The manipulation was so blatant, it would have been laughable if it wasn't so destructive. I returned every package unopened with a note reiterating that contact needed to go through me and James, that gifts sent through third parties to circumvent our boundaries would not be accepted, that they needed to respect our terms, or there would be no relationship at all. This led to more crying phone calls from relatives accusing me of being vindictive, of using my son as a weapon, of denying him the love of his grandparents out of spite. No one seemed to remember or care that my parents were the ones who'd set this whole chain of events in motion, that every boundary I was enforcing existed because they'd proven themselves unable or unwilling to treat me with basic respect. When Lucas was 4 months old, my mother showed up at our house unannounced. I was home alone with the baby, James at work, enjoying a rare moment of peace while Lucas napped. The doorbell rang and I checked the security camera we'd installed specifically for this scenario, and there she was on my porch, holding what looked like a photo album and a stuffed animal. My heart started racing immediately, that old fear response from childhood kicking in despite all the therapy and years of distance. I didn't open the door, instead spoke through the camera's intercom system, asking what she wanted. Her face looked older than I remembered, more lined with grief and anger, but her voice when she spoke was controlled and almost pleasant. She said she just wanted to talk, to see her grandson even if just through a window, that she'd driven 2 hours to get here, and surely I could spare a few minutes for the woman who'd given birth to me and raised me for 25 years. I told her through the intercom that she needed to leave, that showing up without permission wasn't talking, it was ambushing, that this was exactly the kind of boundary violation that made a relationship impossible. She looked directly at the camera with an expression that managed to be both wounded and calculating, her voice taking on that martyred tone I remembered so well from childhood arguments. She said she'd been praying about this for months, that God had told her she needed to make this effort despite my hardness of heart, that she was willing to humble herself and come to my door, even after all the ways I'd hurt her, because that's what mothers do for their children. The manipulation was textbook, casting herself as the noble sufferer and me as the cruel daughter, rewriting 8 years of history in a single monologue. I could feel my resolve wavering, that old, trained response to her pain kicking in, the part of me that had spent 25 years trying to be good enough to earn her approval. Then Lucas made a small sound from his nursery upstairs, just a tiny baby noise amplified through the monitor, and something in me hardened completely. I told her I was calling the police if she didn't leave immediately, that she was trespassing, and I had every word of this conversation recorded. Her face transformed in an instant, the wounded mother mask dropping to reveal pure rage underneath. She started yelling at the camera about how ungrateful I was, how she'd sacrificed everything to raise me, and this was how I repaid her, how I was keeping her grandson hostage to punish her for trying to save my soul. She said James had poisoned me against my own family, that I used to be such a sweet girl before he got his hooks into me, that she knew I was probably being abused, and that's why I was acting this way. Her voice got louder and shriller, and I watched through the camera as neighbors started looking out their windows, attracted by the commotion. I called the police while she was still ranting, and when the dispatcher answered, I explained calmly that my estranged mother was on my property refusing to leave, and I had an infant in the house and felt unsafe. The dispatcher said they'd send someone immediately and to stay inside with the doors locked. My mother must have heard something in my voice, or seen something in my posture through the camera because she suddenly went quiet. Then she did something I'll never forget, something that showed me exactly how far gone she was in her delusion. She sat down on my porch steps with the photo album and the stuffed animal, arranged her face into a peaceful expression, and waited. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, she was the picture of a grieving grandmother, tears streaming down her face, showing the officers photos of me as a child, and explaining in a broken voice that her daughter wouldn't let her meet her grandson because of a terrible misunderstanding years ago. I watched through the camera as one of the officers, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, looked sympathetic and uncertain. The other officer, an older woman, asked my mother some pointed questions about why she'd come without calling first, whether she'd been asked to leave, whether she understood that this was private property. My mother's answers were all carefully crafted half-truths that painted her as a desperate grandmother, driven to extreme measures by a daughter's unreasonable cruelty. I had to come outside eventually to give my statement, and seeing my mother in person for the first time in years was like being hit with a wave of contradictory emotions. She looked smaller than I remembered, older, more fragile, and some part of my heart ached for what we'd lost, even as the rest of me stayed alert to the danger she represented. The female officer took me aside and asked quietly if there was a history of abuse or harassment, if I felt threatened by my mother's presence. I told her everything as concisely as I could, 8 years of boundary violations and manipulation and attempts to destroy my marriage, the recent escalation since Lucas was born, the legal threats through relatives, The officer's expression shifted from neutral to concerned, and she asked if I had documentation. I pulled out my phone and showed her the folder I'd been keeping at my lawyer's advice. Screenshots of messages and emails and voicemails, dates and times of workplace harassment, everything organized and time-stamped. The officer looked at my mother with new eyes after seeing that evidence, and her voice when she spoke to my mother again was considerably colder. My mother was told in no uncertain terms that she needed to leave immediately and not return without explicit permission, that any further contact needed to be through proper channels with both parents' consent, that violation of these terms would result in a restraining order and possible arrest for harassment. My mother looked at me over the officer's shoulder with an expression of such hatred that I actually took a step back. She said loud enough for everyone to hear that I would regret this, that God saw everything I was doing, that the day would come when I'd need her and she wouldn't be there because I'd destroyed every bridge between us. The young male officer looked uncomfortable with the scene unfolding, but the female officer just waited impassively until my mother got in her car and drove away. After she left, the officer gave me her card and told me to call immediately if my mother showed up again, that this pattern of behavior often escalated and I should take it seriously. She also suggested I consider a formal restraining order given the documented history, that waiting until something worse happened wasn't a strategy she'd recommend. I went back inside, shaking so hard I could barely hold my phone to call James. He left work immediately and was home within 30 minutes, finding me sitting on the couch staring at nothing while Lucas slept peacefully upstairs, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded around him. James held me while I cried angry tears. Tears that weren't about sadness anymore, but about rage at having to defend my basic right to safety in my own home. Rage at my mother's ability to twist reality so thoroughly that even police officers initially felt sympathy for her. We talked for hours about what to do next, whether to pursue the restraining order or wait and see if the police warning was enough to deter her. James thought we should get the restraining order immediately, create a legal barrier before things got worse. I was reluctant because some part of me still clung to the idea that official legal action would make the rift permanent and irreparable, as if it wasn't already both those things and had been for years. The decision was made for me 3 days later when my father showed up at James's workplace. He didn't cause a scene this time, just asked the receptionist if he could speak to James privately about a family matter, presenting himself as a concerned father-in-law trying to resolve a misunderstanding. The receptionist, new and unfamiliar with our history, actually called James to the lobby before realizing this might be a problem. James came down and saw my father standing there in his church suit, looking dignified and sorrowful, and James said he felt his whole body go cold with rage and fear. My father launched into a prepared speech about how they just wanted to meet their grandson, how I'd been influenced against them by bitterness and misunderstanding, how he was appealing to man to help facilitate a reconciliation for the child's sake. James cut him off and said very clearly that he needed to leave immediately, that contact needed to go through proper legal channels, if at all, that showing up at his workplace was harassment and would be reported. My father's demeanor changed instantly, the sorrowful grandfather act dropping away to reveal something harder and meaner underneath. He told James he'd looked into his background, knew about the drunk driving charge James had gotten dismissed when he was 19, implied that maybe the court would be interested in knowing what kind of man was raising their grandson. It was a poorly veiled threat, and both of them knew it, my father suggesting he'd dig up or fabricate dirt to use in a custody battle if we didn't give them access to Lucas. James, to his credit, didn't rise to the bait. Just told my father he was recording this conversation on his phone, and every word would be given to our lawyer and the police. My father looked startled, clearly hadn't expected that response, and left quickly after muttering something about James turning me against my own family. James immediately called me and then called our lawyer, and by the end of that day we'd filed for a restraining order against both my parents, citing the documented years of harassment and the escalating threats since Lucas's birth. The court hearing for the restraining order was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and those weeks were a special kind of hell. My parents hired a lawyer, apparently deciding that if they were going to fight for access to Lucas, they'd do it with professional help. Their lawyer sent us a letter claiming my parents were concerned about my mental health, suggesting postpartum depression was affecting my judgment, implying they might seek emergency custody evaluation if we didn't agree to mediation. It was such a transparent intimidation tactic that our lawyer actually laughed when she read it, but it still sent ice through my veins. The idea that they could potentially take Lucas even temporarily, that a judge might believe their version of events over mine, was the stuff of nightmares. I started having panic attacks, waking up in the middle of the night convinced I'd heard someone trying to break into the house, jumping every time the doorbell rang or an unknown number called my phone. James suggested we take a trip to visit his parents for a week before the hearing, get out of town and away from the immediate stress. His parents lived 6 hours away in a small coastal town, and they'd been begging to spend more time with Lucas anyway. We packed up and drove there on a Friday, and for a few days I almost felt normal again. James's mother was everything my own mother had never been, warm and supportive and respectful of our parenting choices, asking before doing anything with Lucas and genuinely interested in our lives beyond just having access to her grandchild. She listened to the whole story one night after Lucas was asleep. James's father there too, both of them silent and increasingly angry, as I detailed 8 years of abuse and manipulation. When I finished, James's mother took my hands and said something that made me cry. She said that family wasn't about blood, but about love and respect, that I'd been right to protect Lucas from people who'd proven they couldn't offer both those things, that she was proud of me for being strong enough to break the cycle even though it was clearly costing me everything. We got back home the day before the hearing, and I spent that night going through all the documentation one more time with our lawyer. She was confident we had a strong case for the restraining order, that the pattern of harassment was clear and well documented, that my parents' recent escalation and veiled threats would work against them. She warned me that my parents might bring character witnesses, probably people from their church who'd testify about what devoted parents they'd been, how out of character it was for me to cut them off, that I needed to be prepared to hear myself described as a troubled or ungrateful daughter. I nodded numbly, already bracing myself for whatever fresh pain the next day would bring. James asked if I wanted him to testify about what he'd witnessed, and the lawyer said absolutely, that his testimony as a neutral party who'd seen their behavior firsthand would be valuable. I went to bed that night barely sleeping, running through possible scenarios in my head, trying to prepare myself to face my parents in court and hold firm against whatever emotional manipulation they'd attempt. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, less dramatic than the TV version of legal proceedings I had in my head. My parents sat on one side with their lawyer, both of them dressed formally and looking like respectable pillars of the community, which of course they were to everyone who didn't know the truth. My mother's eyes were red like she'd been crying, and my father's face was set in lines of dignified sorrow. Their lawyer was a man in his 60s with silver hair and a grandfatherly air, exactly the kind of person who'd make a sympathetic impression. Our lawyer was younger, sharper, a woman who'd made her career defending abuse victims and who saw right through the performance my parents were staging. The judge was a black woman in her 50s who looked tired, and like she'd seen every variation of family dysfunction possible in her courtroom. I sat between James and our lawyer and tried to keep my breathing steady as the proceedings began. My parents' lawyer went first, painting a picture of devoted parents who'd had a falling out with their daughter over religious differences, but who'd always maintained hope for reconciliation. He acknowledged that yes, there had been a difficult period when I'd left home, that my parents' strong faith had made it hard for them to accept some of my choices, but that they'd spent years trying to rebuild the relationship only to be repeatedly rejected. He described their recent attempts to meet their grandson not as harassment, but as the natural desperation of grandparents denied access to family, suggested that perhaps I was struggling with postpartum issues that were affecting my judgment about who was safe around my child. He called a witness from their church, a woman who'd known my parents for decades, who testified tearfully about what wonderful people they were, how active in charity work, how devastated they'd been by the estrangement from their only daughter. It was a masterful performance of misdirection, acknowledging just enough of the truth to seem honest, while reframing everything to cast my parents as the victims. Our lawyer's cross-examination of the church witness was surgical. She asked if the witness had been present when I was asked to leave my parents' home 8 years ago, if she had personal knowledge of what had precipitated that event, if she'd witnessed any of the interactions between my parents and me in recent years. The witness admitted she only knew what my parents had told her, that she hadn't witnessed any of the actual conflicts, that her testimony was based on her opinion of my parents' character in other contexts. Our lawyer then asked if the witness was aware that my parents had contacted my workplace to question my mental fitness, had showed up at my home without permission after being explicitly told not to, had attempted to contact my husband at his workplace with implicit threats. The witness looked uncomfortable and said she wasn't aware of those specific incidents. Our lawyer thanked her and let her step down, the damage to her credibility already done. Then it was my turn to testify, and walking to the witness stand felt like the longest journey of my life. I had to swear to tell the truth with my hand on a Bible, the irony not lost on me given that my parents' version of biblical truth was what had started all of this. Our lawyer took me through the timeline methodically, starting with the incident that led to me leaving home, my father's violence, my mother's role in enforcing the exile. I described the years of harassment, provided specific examples with dates and documentation, explained how the campaign had intensified after Lucas's birth. I kept my voice steady and factual, resisting the urge to let emotion color my testimony, knowing that any sign of hysteria would be used against me. My mother started crying loudly during my description of being hit and thrown out, and their lawyer had to pass her tissues while she performed her grief for the judge. My parents' lawyer cross-examined me with a grandfatherly condescension that made my skin crawl. He asked if I didn't think I was being a bit harsh, holding on to anger from something that happened 8 years ago, whether I'd considered that my parents' reaction to finding birth control might have been cultural shock rather than abuse. He suggested that perhaps I'd misinterpreted their attempts to reconnect as harassment when really they were just persistent expressions of love. He asked if I was sure I wasn't projecting my own childhood pain onto the current situation with Lucas, if maybe therapy might help me process these feelings in a healthier way than cutting off all contact. Each question was designed to make me sound unreasonable, vindictive, possibly unstable. I answered each one carefully, pointing out that being hit wasn't a cultural difference but assault, that showing up at workplaces and homes after being told not to wasn't persistent love but stalking, that I'd been in therapy for years, and my therapist supported my decision to maintain boundaries. The lawyer looked frustrated that I wasn't falling apart under his questioning, wasn't giving him the emotional outburst he clearly wanted to use against me. James testified next, and his quiet fury was more effective than any dramatics could have been. He described in detail what he'd witnessed over the years, the workplace harassment, the constant messages from relatives acting as flying monkeys, the threats from my father at his office just weeks ago. He pulled out his phone and played the recording of that conversation. My father's voice clear as he implied he'd use James's teenage drunk driving charge against us in court. The judge's expression shifted noticeably as she listened, and my parents' lawyer objected that the recording might not be admissible, but the judge overruled him, saying she wanted to hear it. When my father's voice said the words about looking into James's background and what the court might think, I saw the judge write something down with considerable force. James's testimony was brief but devastating, a calm recitation of facts that painted a picture of systematic harassment and escalating threats that no amount of grandfatherly cross-examination could soften. Our lawyer then presented the documentation, a thick folder of printed emails, text messages, voicemails, incident reports from the police visit, statements from my workplace and James's about the harassment they'd witnessed. She walked the judge through the pattern, showing how each boundary we'd set had been immediately violated, how each attempt at reconciliation had come with unacceptable conditions, how the behavior had escalated rather than improved with time. She pointed out that my parents' own lawyer had sent a letter threatening custody evaluation, which she argued was proof that their interest wasn't in genuine relationship, but in control and punishment for my refusal to submit to their authority. The judge asked my parents' lawyer if he had evidence to contradict any of the documented incidents, and he admitted he did not, but maintained that his client's intentions had been misunderstood. that they were simply desperate grandparents who'd made some poor choices in their desperation. The judge took a 15-minute recess to review all the materials, and those 15 minutes felt like hours. My mother kept looking at me across the courtroom with an expression that alternated between wounded pleading and cold anger. My father sat rigid and unmoving, staring straight ahead like if he didn't acknowledge my presence, I would cease to exist. James held my hand so tightly our fingers went numb, and our lawyer reviewed her notes with a calm expression that I hoped meant she thought we'd presented well. When the judge returned, her face was unreadable, that professional neutrality judges must learn to maintain regardless of how they actually feel about what they're hearing. She asked my parents to stand, and then she asked me and James to stand. And for a moment, we were all on our feet facing her while she decided the future of our family's boundary. The judge granted the restraining order for 1 year with the possibility of renewal. She said the pattern of harassment was clear and concerning, that the escalation since the baby's birth suggested the behavior would likely continue without legal intervention, that my parents' demonstrated unwillingness to respect boundaries left her no choice but to impose legal ones. She specified that my parents were to have no direct or indirect contact with me, James, or Lucas, that they were not to come within 500 feet of our home or workplaces, that they were not to use third parties to send messages or gifts on their behalf. She said that if, at the end of the year, my parents had complied completely with the order and could demonstrate genuine changed behavior, we could revisit the possibility of supervised contact, but that decision would be entirely at our discretion. My mother let out a wail that echoed through the courtroom, and my father had to physically support her as she collapsed against him sobbing. Part of me wanted to feel triumph that we'd won, but mostly I just felt exhausted and sad watching my mother's performance of devastation. We left the courthouse through a side exit our lawyer had arranged, avoiding the front where my parents would be leaving. In the car driving home, I couldn't stop shaking, adrenaline finally releasing after hours of forced calm. James kept asking if I was okay, and I kept saying yes, even though we both knew I wouldn't be for a while. Maybe wouldn't ever be fully okay with the fact that I'd had to get a court order to keep my own parents away from my child. Our lawyer called that evening to check on me and to warn that my parents might try to appeal or find loopholes in the restraining order, that I should remain vigilant and document any violations immediately. She said I'd done well in court, that my testimony had been credible and compelling, that the judge had clearly seen through my parents' attempt to paint themselves as misunderstood victims. It should have felt like validation, but instead it just felt like another exhausting chapter in a story I desperately wanted to end. The first week after the restraining order was eerily quiet, like the eye of a hurricane where you know the storm isn't over, but you can't see the next wave coming yet. Lucas was oblivious to all of it, just a happy baby who smiled and cooed and hit his developmental milestones right on schedule, untouched by the legal drama swirling around him. I found myself watching him sleep and feeling grateful that he'd never know his grandparents, never experience their conditional love, or feel the sting of not being enough for them. James pointed out that Lucas would have questions eventually, would want to know why he didn't have maternal grandparents like other kids, and I'd have to figure out how to explain it in a way that was honest, but not scarring. I pushed that worry into the future where it belonged, focusing instead on the immediate relief of knowing they legally couldn't just show up at my door anymore. The quiet broke on day 8 when Aunt Marie called crying so hard I could barely understand her. She said my mother had been hospitalized, that the stress of the restraining order had triggered some kind of cardiac event, that she was stable, but the doctors were concerned about her heart. Aunt Marie begged me to come to the hospital, said my mother was asking for me, that surely this changed things, that I couldn't let my mother possibly die without seeing her one last time. Every word was designed to trigger my guilt, and it worked partially. That old programming kicking in telling me I was a terrible daughter for causing my mother such distress. But I'd learned over the years to let those feelings pass through me without acting on them, to recognize manipulation even when it came wrapped in genuine medical crisis. I told Aunt Marie I hoped my mother recovered fully, that I'd pray for her health, but that I wouldn't be visiting because the restraining order existed for good reasons that didn't disappear just because someone got sick. Aunt Marie's tone changed immediately from pleading to angry, asking how I could be so cold, So heartless. Whether I'd feel guilty if my mother died knowing her daughter had refused to see her. I wanted to scream that my mother had chosen this, had chosen conditions over connection, had chosen to show up at my house and threaten my husband and refuse every reasonable compromise. But I was too tired for that conversation. I just said I was sorry she was caught in the middle of this, that I knew it was hard for her, but that my decision was final. After I hung up, I called our lawyer to report the attempted contact through a third party, and she said she'd send a formal letter to Aunt Marie, reminding her that facilitating communication between us was a violation of the restraining order that could have legal consequences. I felt bad about that, about dragging Aunt Marie into the legal mess when she'd only ever tried to help. But I also knew that if I let this crack in the boundary go unaddressed, my parents would exploit it until the whole wall came down. My mother recovered from her cardiac event within a few days, and I learned through the family grapevine that it had been a panic attack severe enough to mimic a heart attack rather than an actual cardiac problem. I wasn't surprised. My mother had a history of dramatic physical symptoms in response to emotional stress, a pattern I'd seen play out throughout my childhood whenever things didn't go her way. What did surprise me was learning that she'd apparently told the hospital staff, and anyone who'd listen, that her daughter had gotten a restraining order against her for trying to meet her grandchild, painting herself as a victim of cruel legal overreach. The story had spread through their church community and was generating exactly the sympathy and outrage she'd wanted. I got messages from distant relatives I'd never even met telling me I should be ashamed, that persecuting elderly parents was a sin, that I'd regret this when they were gone and it was too late to make amends. Each message was like a small cut, none fatal on their own, but collectively exhausting and painful. James suggested I block everyone, change my number, cut off all possible channels for their poison to reach me. But something in me resisted that complete isolation. I told myself I was keeping channels open in case there was genuine emergency. But really, I think part of me was still hoping someone from my family would actually listen to my side, would break through the narrative my parents had constructed and see the truth. It was a foolish hope, and I knew it. But hope doesn't always respond to logic or evidence. Our church community rallied around us instead, bringing meals and offering babysitting and creating a chosen family that functioned better than my biological one ever had. James's parents called weekly to check on us and sent care packages and made it clear that they considered me their daughter, regardless of what my biological parents chose to do. 3 months into the restraining order, I got a letter forwarded through our lawyer from my father. The restraining order prohibited direct contact, but apparently legal correspondence through attorneys was allowed in certain circumstances. The letter was typed and formal, and it said that he'd been doing a lot of reflection and prayer since the court hearing. He acknowledged that they'd made mistakes in how they'd handled things over the years, that perhaps they'd been too rigid in their expectations, that they could see now how their actions might have seemed threatening, even though that wasn't their intention. He said they were willing to attend family counseling if that's what it would take to build a relationship with their grandson, that they understood they'd need to earn back our trust. He closed by saying he loved me, that he'd always loved me even when he didn't know how to show it in ways I could accept, and that he hoped we could find a path forward for Lucas's sake, if not for ours. I read that letter 10 times trying to decide if it was genuine or just a new strategy. James read it and said it hit some of the right notes, but was missing crucial things, like any acknowledgement of the actual harm they'd caused, or any apology for specific actions rather than vague mistakes. Our lawyer said it was fairly typical of abusers trying to regain access to victims, acknowledging just enough to seem reasonable while not actually committing to meaningful change. My therapist, who I'd been seeing weekly since the court hearing, asked me what I felt when I read it. I told her I felt tired, that I wanted to believe it was real, but knew that my parents had burned through my benefit of the doubt years ago, that even if it was genuine, it would take years of demonstrated changed behavior before I'd consider allowing them access to Lucas. She nodded and said that was a healthy boundary, that hope for change was fine as long as it didn't override my need for safety. I responded through our lawyer with a letter outlining what accountability would actually look like. I said they needed to attend individual therapy for a minimum of 6 months, and be able to provide documentation from their therapist that they'd made progress on their controlling behaviors and inability to respect boundaries. I said they needed to write a detailed acknowledgement of the specific harms they'd caused. Not vague mistakes, but actual actions with actual consequences that they took responsibility for. I said they needed to demonstrate respect for my marriage by acknowledging James as my husband and Lucas's father without conditions or cavities. I said that only after all of that, and only if our family therapist agreed they were ready, would I consider supervised contact with Lucas in a therapeutic setting. I knew these conditions were extensive and difficult, but that was the point. If they were genuinely committed to change, they'd do the work. If they just wanted access without accountability, the conditions would expose that. My father's response came 2 weeks later, again through lawyers. He said my conditions were unreasonable and punitive, that I was requiring them to submit to secular therapy that would undermine their faith, that I was demanding they accept sinful behavior as the price of seeing their grandson. He said they'd been willing to compromise, but I was clearly not interested in actual reconciliation, only in punishing them for their beliefs. The letter made clear that his earlier conciliatory tone had been a strategy, not a genuine shift, and that faced with real accountability, he'd reverted to his familiar patterns of blame and religious justification. I felt oddly relieved reading it, the clarity of his rejection of my terms removing any lingering doubt about whether I was being too harsh. James read it and just shook his head, said at least now we knew for sure that nothing had actually changed, that the court hearing and restraining order hadn't prompted any real self-reflection. Lucas turned 1-year-old 6 months into the restraining order, and we threw a party with James's family and our church friends, and every person who'd supported us through the nightmare of the past year. It was joyful and loud and full of love, and Lucas smashed cake into his face and laughed with pure delight while everyone cheered. I took photos of him surrounded by people who loved him unconditionally, who celebrated his existence without strings attached, and I felt grateful for this chosen family, even as I mourned the biological family who'd chosen to absent themselves. James's mother made a toast about how lucky Lucas was to have parents who loved him enough to protect him, and I saw several people glance at me with understanding in their eyes. After the party, after everyone left and Lucas was asleep, James and I sat on the couch looking at photos from the day, and he asked if I was okay. I told him I was, that I'd expected to feel sad, but instead felt mostly at peace with our choices. The restraining order was set to expire in 6 months, and our lawyer reached out to ask if we wanted to renew it. The decision should have been easy given everything that had happened, but I found myself hesitating. Part of me wondered if letting it expire would be a gesture of goodwill, a way to leave the door open if my parents ever genuinely changed. Our lawyer warned against that thinking, pointed out that letting it expire didn't mean we had to have contact, just meant we'd lose the legal protection if they started harassing us again. She recommended renewing for another year, said we could always choose not to enforce it if circumstances changed, but having it in place was smart, given their history. James agreed with her, said he didn't trust my parents not to escalate again if given the opportunity, that the restraining order had given us a year of peace we wouldn't have had without it. I knew they were right, but signing the papers to renew it felt like closing a door permanently, accepting that my parents would never be the people I needed them to be. We renewed the restraining order, and my parents didn't contest it this time. I heard through relatives that they'd essentially given up, were telling people they'd tried everything but their daughter was lost to them, that they were praying for God to soften my heart but accepting that it might never happen. The narrative they'd constructed cast them as martyrs and me as the villain, and I'd stopped trying to correct it within the family. The people who mattered knew the truth, and the ones who believed my parents' version weren't people I needed in my life anyway. It was a harsh calculus, but a necessary one, sorting people into those who'd stand with me and those who'd stand with my abusers, finding out that family loyalty often mattered more to people than truth or justice or basic human decency. Lucas started walking at 13 months, taking wobbly steps between me and James while we cheered him on like he'd just climbed Everest. He said his first word at 14 months. Dada, of course, because he adored James. And James cried happy tears that this little person loved him so purely. We were building a life that was normal and happy and full of everyday magic. And most days I didn't think about my parents at all. But sometimes I'd see a grandmother with her grandchild at the park, or hear a friend talk about their parents babysitting, and I'd feel the loss like a physical ache. Not loss of my actual parents, but loss of the parents I'd wished they could be. The grandparents I'd wished Lucas could have. James would find me quiet and distant on those days, and he'd know without me saying what I was thinking about. Would remind me gently that grief for what never was is still real grief that deserves to be felt. When Lucas was 18 months old, my father died suddenly of a massive heart attack. Aunt Marie called to tell me, her voice thick with tears, and for a moment I couldn't process what she was saying. My father had been 62 years old, not young but not elderly, seemingly healthy the last I'd heard anything about him. He'd collapsed at church during Sunday service and was dead before the ambulance arrived, Aunt Marie said. And my mother was destroyed with grief. She asked if I'd come to the funeral. Said surely death changed the restraining order calculus, that my mother needed me now more than ever. I told her I'd call her back and hung up, then sat on the floor of my kitchen trying to feel something about my father being dead. What came wasn't sadness exactly, but a complicated tangle of relief and regret and anger that he'd died before any reconciliation was possible, before he'd had the chance to know his grandson or to make amends for the harm he'd caused. I called our lawyer first, before making any decisions about the funeral, needing to understand the legal implications of attending. She said the restraining order was still in effect, and technically my presence at the funeral could be considered a violation if my mother objected, but that she doubted any judge would enforce it under these circumstances if I was simply attending to pay respects. She also warned that my mother might use the funeral as an opportunity to create a scene or to try to manipulate me emotionally when my defenses were down, that I should be prepared for anything if I chose to go. James said he'd support whatever I decided, but that I shouldn't feel obligated to attend just because society expected it, that my father had made his choices, and one of the consequences was that his daughter might not mourn him publicly. I sat with the decision for 2 days, weighing duty against self-protection, trying to figure out what I owed to a dead man who'd hit me and disowned me, and spent years trying to destroy my marriage. I decided to go to the funeral but not the reception after, to pay my respects from a distance and leave before there was opportunity for confrontation. James offered to come with me, but I asked him to stay home with Lucas, not wanting my son anywhere near that environment, even if he was too young to remember it. I wore black, but not the traditional mourning clothes from our culture, a subtle rebellion that I knew my mother would notice and interpret as disrespect. The funeral was at their church, the same building where I'd attended services every Sunday of my childhood, where I'd been baptized and confirmed and taught that God's love was conditional on obedience. Walking through those doors after so many years felt like stepping back in time, the smell of incense and old wood and judgment still hanging in the air exactly as I remembered it. I sat in the back row, arriving just as the service started to avoid small talk with relatives. My mother sat in the front with my father's siblings and their children, dressed in black from head to toe with a veil over her face, like something from another century. She looked smaller than I remembered, shrunken with grief, and I felt an unwilling surge of pity for her that I immediately tried to suppress. The priest gave a eulogy that painted my father as a pillar of the community, a devoted husband and father, a man of unshakable faith who'd lived his principles without compromise. I listened to this sanitized version of the man who'd raised me, and felt angry that no one would speak the truth, that his violence and rigidity and cruelty would be buried with him while only the acceptable parts were remembered. Several people spoke about his generosity to the church, his mentoring of young men in the congregation, his dedication to preserving traditional values in a changing world. No one mentioned that those traditional values had included hitting his daughter and throwing her out at 25 for trying to control her own reproduction. Halfway through the service, someone must have told my mother I was there because she turned in her seat and looked directly at me. Even through the veil, I could see her eyes, red and swollen and full of an emotion I couldn't quite read. Was it grief? Anger? Longing? Accusation? Probably all of those things mixed together in a way that would be impossible to separate. She stared at me for a long moment, and I stared back, neither of us looking away. Some kind of silent communication passing between us that I didn't have words for. Then she turned back to face the front and the service continued, but I could see her shoulders shaking with sobs, could hear her wailing at certain moments in a display of grief that was both genuine and performed. My aunts clustered around her offering comfort, and I saw several of them glance back at me with expressions of contempt, clearly blaming me for adding to her suffering by staying away these past years. After the service, people filed past the open casket to pay their final respect. I waited until almost everyone had gone through before joining the line, wanting to minimize the time I'd have to spend in that room with my mother nearby. When I reached the casket, I looked down at my father's face, carefully made up by the funeral home to look peaceful and younger than he'd been. I tried to feel something beyond the numbness that had settled over me, tried to access grief or anger or closure or anything at all. What came instead was a strange detachment, like I was looking at a wax figure of someone I'd known long ago rather than my actual father. I thought about all the ways he'd hurt me and all the ways I'd wanted him to love me, and how neither of those things mattered anymore now that he was gone. I whispered, "I hope you found peace," because it was true even if our relationship had been poison, and then I walked toward the exit before anyone could try to stop me. My mother intercepted me in the vestibule, moving faster than I would have thought possible for someone who'd appeared so broken moments before. She grabbed my arm with surprising strength and said my name like a prayer or a curse. I couldn't tell which. Up close, I could see that under the veil her face was ravaged with grief, eyes sunken and cheeks hollow like she hadn't eaten in days. She said we needed to talk, that surely I couldn't leave without talking to her, that my father had died without ever reconciling with his daughter, and she couldn't bear the thought that the same might happen to her. I gently removed her hand from my arm and told her I was sorry for her loss, that I hoped she'd find comfort in her faith and her community, but that nothing had changed between us just because my father was dead. She made a sound that was half sob, half scream, and said everything had changed, that she was alone now, that she'd spent 3 years trying to respect my boundaries and look where it had gotten her, buried her husband without her daughter by her side. Several relatives moved toward us, sensing a scene developing, and I knew I needed to leave immediately before this escalated into something that would give them all ammunition to use against me. I told my mother again that I was sorry and turned to go, but she followed me out into the parking lot still talking, her voice rising as she went. She said I was killing her just like I'd killed my father with the stress of the estrangement, that his heart attack was my fault for refusing to reconcile, that I'd have to live with that guilt for the rest of my life. The accusation was so outrageous and so perfectly in character that I almost laughed. This immediate pivot from grief to blame, from asking for connection to weaponizing death. I turned back to face her and said very clearly that my father's heart attack was the result of 62 years of lifestyle choices and genetics, not my boundaries, and that if she genuinely believed I'd killed him, then she should stay far away from me for her own safety. Her face went through several expressions in rapid succession: shock that I'd pushed back, rage that I wasn't accepting blame, and something that looked almost like respect that I'd stood my ground. Then she pulled off her veil completely and stepped close to me, close enough that I could smell the coffee on her breath and see the broken blood vessels in her eyes from crying. She said in a low voice that was somehow more threatening than her screaming had been, "You have taken everything from me. My daughter, my grandchild, and now my husband. I will never forgive you for this. When you come crawling back someday, and you will because everyone needs their mother eventually, I will remember this moment. I will remember how you looked at your father's body with no tears, how you walked away from me in my darkest hour, and I will close my door in your face, the way you've closed yours in mine." Then she turned and walked back into the church, leaving me standing in the parking lot shaking with adrenaline and fury and something that felt almost like liberation. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I felt steady enough to drive, replaying her words in my head and trying to process what had just happened. Part of me had hoped that my father's death might soften her somehow, might make her realize that life was short and grudges were pointless, and love should be unconditional. Instead, it had revealed exactly what I'd suspected all along: that her grief was real, but it didn't make her less toxic. That loss had hardened her rather than opened her. That she'd rather nurse her victimhood than do the work of actual reconciliation. I called James from the parking lot and told him what had happened, and he said he was proud of me for going, for trying, and for leaving when it became clear nothing would change. He asked if I was okay to drive, and I said yes, even though I wasn't sure. And I made the 40-minute drive home on autopilot while my mind replayed every moment of the encounter. Lucas was napping when I got home, and I stood in his doorway watching him sleep. This beautiful, innocent child who would grow up never knowing his maternal grandfather, never understanding the dysfunction he'd been protected from. James came up behind me and wrapped his arms around me and asked what I was thinking. I told him I was thinking that I'd made the right choice, that seeing my mother today had confirmed everything I already knew about why we couldn't have her in Lucas's life. I told him I was also thinking about how much it still hurt, despite knowing it was right, how I'd probably always carry some grief for the family I'd needed but never had. James said that was okay, that I could mourn the loss and still be certain about the choice, that both things could be true at the same time. We stood there watching our son sleep until he woke up and saw us and smiled. And I felt grateful that at least Lucas's childhood would be so different from my own. The weeks after the funeral were surprisingly quiet, like my mother's curse in the parking lot had exhausted her capacity for harassment. I heard through relatives that she was barely functional with grief, that my father's siblings had moved her into an assisted living apartment because she couldn't manage the house alone, that she'd stopped going to church and spent most of her time in bed. Part of me felt guilty for not being there to help her through it, that old programming kicking in again. But I reminded myself that she had a whole community of people who could support her, that I wasn't responsible for managing her grief when she'd spent years trying to destroy my peace. Our lawyer suggested we wait a few months before reassessing the restraining order, that grief made people unpredictable, and it was better to maintain boundaries while my mother was in such a vulnerable state. 3 months after my father's death, my mother's sister called me. Not Aunt Marie, who'd been our go-between, but my mother's older sister, Patricia, who'd never particularly liked me even before the estrangement. She said she was calling against my mother's wishes because someone needed to tell me the truth about what was happening. My mother had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's, Patricia said, and the stress of my father's death had accelerated the cognitive decline significantly. She was forgetting things, getting confused about where she was, sometimes not recognizing people she'd known for decades. Patricia said the doctors thought she had maybe 5 to 10 years before it got really bad, and that if I was ever going to make peace with her, it needed to be soon while she still knew who I was. The guilt trip was obvious, but effective. The implication that I'd regret it forever if my mother died or lost her mind without us reconciling, that I'd have to live with that choice for the rest of my life. I thanked Patricia for telling me and said I needed to think about what to do with that information. After I hung up, I sat with it for a long time, trying to separate my genuine feelings from the manipulation, trying to figure out what I owed to a woman who was sick and aging and still fundamentally the same person who'd cursed me in a parking lot 3 months ago. James said he worried that this was just another tactic, that conveniently being diagnosed with Alzheimer's right after threatening me seemed suspicious, that even if it was real, it didn't obligate me to subject myself to more abuse. Our therapist asked what outcome I was hoping for if I did reach out, whether I thought my mother was capable of the kind of reconciliation that would be meaningful rather than just performative. I didn't have good answers to any of these questions, just a tangle of guilt and grief and exhaustion at the thought of opening this door again. I decided to request a meeting with my mother through our lawyers, in a neutral location with a mediator present, to see if there was any path forward that wouldn't compromise the boundaries I'd spent years establishing. The conditions were strict. My mother would have to acknowledge specific harms she'd caused, commit to respecting my marriage and my parenting choices, and accept that any relationship would be gradual and supervised. I didn't expect her to agree to these terms. Honestly expected her lawyer to come back with counter-demands that would make it clear nothing had actually changed. But to my surprise, my mother agreed to everything. Patricia said the Alzheimer's diagnosis had scared her, made her realize she might not have much time left to fix things, that she was willing to do whatever it took to have some kind of relationship with me and meet her grandson before it was too late. The mediation session was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon at a family therapy office halfway between our house and my mother's new apartment. I was so anxious the night before that I barely slept, running through every possible scenario in my head, every way it could go wrong or be another manipulation or end up causing more harm than healing. James offered again to come with me, but I said no, that this was something I needed to do alone, that his presence would just give my mother an excuse to focus on him instead of her own behavior. I dressed carefully that morning, wanting to look put together and confident, armor against whatever emotional warfare might be coming. Lucas was at James's parents' house for the day, safely away from anything that might happen. And knowing he was protected helped me feel more able to walk into this meeting without my defenses completely up. My mother was already there when I arrived, sitting in the therapy office waiting room with Patricia beside her for support. She looked older than she had at the funeral, more frail, her hair gone almost completely white and her hands trembling slightly in her lap. When she saw me, her face crumpled and she started to stand, reaching toward me like she wanted to embrace me. I stayed where I was, not moving toward her, and after a moment she sat back down looking hurt. The mediator, a woman named Dr. Chen who specialized in estranged family reunification, came out and led us into her office. It was a neutral space with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle, tissues on every surface, the kind of room designed for difficult conversation. Dr. Chen explained the ground rules. Each person would have time to speak without interruption. We'd focus on specific behaviors rather than character attacks. The goal was to understand each other's perspectives and see if reconciliation was possible. My mother went first, and she started by saying she was sorry. She said it had taken her too long to realize how much damage she'd caused, that she'd been so focused on what she believed was right that she'd lost sight of what mattered, which was her relationship with her daughter. She said she'd spent the past 3 months in therapy since the Alzheimer's diagnosis, trying to understand why she'd been so rigid and controlling, facing some difficult truths about how she'd been parented and how she'd repeated those patterns with me. She said she knew an apology couldn't undo years of harm, but she wanted me to know she saw it now, saw how her actions had been abusive, even if that wasn't what she'd intended. She said she'd been wrong about James, wrong to demand I leave him, wrong to show up at our home and his workplace, wrong to use my son as a weapon to try to force reconciliation on her terms. It was everything I'd wanted to hear for years, and hearing it now felt surreal and somehow insufficient all at once. When it was my turn to speak, I told her about the years since she'd thrown me out, the way her harassment had affected my career and my mental health and my marriage. I told her about the fear I'd lived with, never knowing when she'd show up or what she'd do next, the way I'd had to install security cameras and change my phone number and get a restraining order just to feel safe in my own life. I told her about the grief of losing my parents while they were still alive, mourning the relationship we'd never had while they were busy trying to destroy the life I'd built. I told her about holding Lucas for the first time and feeling absolutely certain that I would never treat him the way she'd treated me, that I'd break the cycle of conditional love and control even if it meant she never got to know him. My voice stayed steady through most of it but broke when I talked about the funeral, about her accusation that I'd killed my father, about the curse she'd placed on me in the parking lot. I asked her if she even remembered saying those things, if she understood how that kind of cruelty stayed with a person. My mother looked genuinely shocked when I described the parking lot encounter, said she didn't remember saying those things, that she'd been so out of her mind with grief that whole day was mostly a blur. Patricia confirmed quietly that my mother had been in a bad state after the funeral, that she'd needed sedatives to sleep for weeks afterward, that the things she'd said might have been grief-induced rather than reflective of her actual feelings. I wanted to feel relief at that explanation, but instead felt angry that I was expected to excuse her behavior because she'd been upset, as if I hadn't also been grieving in my own way, as if my feelings didn't matter as much as her. Dr. Chen intervened gently, saying that understanding context didn't mean excusing harm, that my mother could acknowledge she'd been in crisis and still take responsibility for the impact of her words. My mother nodded and said she took full responsibility, that regardless of what she remembered, she believed me about what had happened, and she was sorry for adding to my pain. We talked for 2 hours, circling around the same issues from different angles, trying to find common ground that felt genuine rather than strategic. My mother asked if she could meet Lucas, and I said not yet, that we needed to rebuild trust first, that I needed to see consistent changed behavior over time before I'd expose my son to her. She looked disappointed but said she understood, that she'd wait as long as it took, that she'd do whatever I needed to feel safe. I asked her directly about the Alzheimer's diagnosis, whether she was using it to manipulate me into reconciliation, and she looked hurt but answered honestly. She said yes, she'd probably emphasized it more than necessary when talking to Patricia because she was desperate and scared of dying estranged from her only child, but that the diagnosis itself was real and documented, and she could provide medical records if I didn't believe her. The admission of manipulation, even within the context of trying to reconcile, was oddly reassuring, a sign that she was at least being honest about her dishonesty. By the end of the session, we'd agreed to try monthly supervised meetings with Dr. Chen, phone calls once a week, with boundaries about what topics were allowed, and a gradual building of trust that would be entirely at my pace. My mother signed a document acknowledging the harms she'd caused and committing to specific changed behaviors going forward. Dr. Chen said this was a promising start, but warned us both that reconciliation was a long process with setbacks likely, that we shouldn't expect immediate healing or perfect communication. My mother asked if she could hug me before we left, and I hesitated, but finally said yes. And when her arms went around me, I felt myself stiffen but not pull away. She whispered, "I've missed you so much," into my hair, and I didn't say anything back because I wasn't sure what was true anymore, what I felt versus what I thought I should feel. The drive home felt disorienting, like I'd just participated in something that might have been real or might have been another layer of manipulation I couldn't see yet. James was waiting when I got home, Lucas already asleep, and he asked how it went. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that my mother had said all the right things, but I wasn't sure if I believed her, that I felt exhausted and confused and cautiously hopeful despite knowing better. He asked what I needed from him, and I said I needed him to keep watching for red flags, to tell me if he saw signs I was falling back into old patterns, to remind me that being hopeful didn't mean being stupid. We agreed that the monthly supervised meetings were low risk enough to try, that I'd maintain all my boundaries and document everything, that at the first sign of backsliding, we'd end the experiment immediately. The first phone call happened 3 days after the mediation session, my mother's voice tentative and formal, like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. We talked for exactly 15 minutes as we'd agreed, sticking to safe topics like the weather and what she'd been reading and how Lucas was developing. She asked if I could send her a photo of him, and I said I'd think about it, not ready to share that piece of him yet even in digital form. After we hung up, James asked how it had felt, and I said strange, like talking to a distant relative I was trying to be polite to, rather than my mother. The second call the following week was slightly easier, my mother venturing into asking about my work and whether I was still nursing, showing interest in my life in a way she never had before. I told her about a difficult patient I'd had that week, and she listened without judgment or trying to fix it, just acknowledged that it sounded hard and said she was proud of how I'd handled it. Those words, "I'm proud of you," said so simply about something mundane, made me cry after the call ended in a way the bigger apologies had. Our first supervised meeting with Dr. Chen happened 2 weeks after the initial mediation, and my mother brought a box of things she'd saved from my childhood. There were photos of me at every age, report cards, artwork I'd made in elementary school, a blanket my grandmother had crocheted for me before she died. She said she'd kept everything even after throwing me out, couldn't bring herself to get rid of the evidence that I'd existed and been loved, and she wanted me to have these things now for Lucas to see someday. I went through the box with hands that shook slightly, seeing my younger self smiling in photos taken before everything went wrong, before religion and control had twisted our relationship into something toxic. There was a photo of my father holding me as a baby, his face soft with love, and I had to look away because the cognitive dissonance was too much, trying to reconcile that loving father with the man who'd hit me 15 years later. Dr. Chen asked my mother what she'd learned in her individual therapy about why she'd been so controlling. My mother took a long breath and said she'd been working on understanding her own childhood, how her father had been violent, and her mother had coped by trying to control everything she could, creating rigid rules that kept them safe from his unpredictable rage. She'd internalized the message that control equaled safety, that deviation from prescribed paths led to danger, and she'd passed that trauma down to me without ever examining it. She said her therapist had helped her see that what she'd called faith and tradition was actually fear wearing a more acceptable face, terror that if she didn't control every aspect of her family's life, something terrible would happen. When I'd defied her by having a life and making choices she didn't approve of, it hadn't felt like normal parent-child differentiation, but like I was actively choosing danger, and she'd responded with the only tools she had, which were manipulation and control, and cutting me off when those didn't work. I asked her why James had been such a threat to her specifically, why she couldn't accept him even though he'd never been anything but respectful and good to me. She was quiet for a long moment, and then said honestly that James represented everything she couldn't control. A person who'd chosen me without her approval, who'd supported my independence instead of encouraging me to defer to her authority, who'd given me a vision of family that didn't include her at the center. She said she'd told herself it was about religion and morality, but really it was about losing her grip on me, watching me build a life that didn't need her input or blessing. The honesty was startling and painful, and exactly what I'd needed to hear for years. Dr. Chen asked how I felt hearing that, and I said relieved that having her name the real issue instead of hiding behind religious justifications felt like progress even though the damage was already done. The third supervised session happened a month later, and I brought James with me this time at Dr. Chen's suggestion. My mother looked nervous when she saw him, her hands fidgeting with her purse strap, and for a long moment no one spoke. Then my mother stood and walked over to James and said she owed him an apology. She said she'd treated him terribly, had tried to destroy his reputation and his relationship with me, had blamed him for choices that were mine alone. She said he'd been a better husband to me than she'd been a mother, that he'd protected and supported me when she'd been trying to tear me down, and that she was grateful he'd been there when she hadn't been. James accepted her apology with more grace than she deserved, said he appreciated her saying that, but that the real work would be in changed behavior going forward. My mother nodded and said she understood, that she was committed to respecting their marriage and never again suggesting I should leave him. Dr. Chen facilitated a conversation between the three of us about what a relationship might look like going forward if things continued to progress. My mother said she wanted to be a grandmother to Lucas, wanted to be part of his life in whatever capacity we allowed, that she understood it would be limited and supervised at first. James said directly that his condition for allowing that was seeing consistent changed behavior for at least 6 months, that one backslide into old patterns and the door would close permanently. My mother agreed without hesitation, said she'd rather have a limited supervised relationship than no relationship at all, that she'd take whatever we were willing to give. I watched this exchange feeling oddly detached, like I was observing negotiations about someone else's child rather than my own. Part of me still couldn't believe this was happening, that my mother was actually doing the work and saying the right things and showing up consistently to these difficult sessions. Between sessions, the weekly phone calls continued, gradually becoming less awkward and more genuine. My mother told me about her Alzheimer's support group, how scary it was to know her mind was slowly failing, how she was trying to make amends for past mistakes while she still could. She asked about my nursing work and actually listened to the answers, asked follow-up questions that showed she'd remembered previous conversations. She sent cards for Lucas's half-birthday and for James's birthday, nothing manipulative or guilt-laden, just simple messages of love and acknowledgement. I found myself actually looking forward to the calls sometimes, glimpses of the mother I'd always wished for appearing in these carefully boundaried interactions. James noticed the shift in me and asked if I was getting too hopeful too fast, and I told him maybe, but that I'd learned to hold hope and skepticism at the same time, to want the best while preparing for the worst. 4 months into our reconciliation attempt, my mother asked if she could meet Lucas, just for an hour in Dr. Chen's office with all of us present. I'd known this request was coming but still wasn't prepared for how conflicted it made me feel. Lucas was almost 2 years old now, starting to form memories and understand relationships. And once he met his grandmother, there was no going back from that. If she regressed to her old patterns after bonding with him, it would hurt him, not just me. James and I talked about it for hours, weighing the risks against the possibility that this might be genuine, that my mother might have actually changed enough to be a safe presence in our son's life. We agreed to a trial meeting with strict conditions: 1 hour maximum in Dr. Chen's office, all conversation in English so we could monitor it, and we'd end it immediately if my mother showed any signs of trying to undermine our authority or make Lucas uncomfortable. The day of the meeting, I was so anxious I felt physically ill. We'd prepared Lucas as much as you can prepare a not-quite-2-year-old, told him he was going to meet Grandma Emma, showed him photos so she wouldn't be a complete stranger. My mother arrived early and was waiting in Dr. Chen's office when we got there, and I could see she'd been crying, her eyes red and her hands shaking. When Lucas toddled into the room holding James's hand, my mother made a small sound like a sob swallowed, and tears started streaming down her face. Lucas looked at her curiously. This crying stranger his parents had brought him to meet, and said his new favorite word, "Why?" which broke the tension and made everyone laugh. My mother knelt down to his level and said, "Because Grandma is so happy to finally meet you, sweet boy." And Lucas seemed to accept this explanation and went back to the toys Dr. Chen had set out. For the next hour, my mother was perfect. She followed Lucas's lead, didn't push for hugs or physical affection, just played alongside him and made gentle conversation. She asked James and me questions about Lucas's routines and preferences, respecting that we were the parents and she was just a visitor in his life. When Lucas brought her a toy, she received it like a precious gift and thanked him solemnly. When he got frustrated with a puzzle, she waited to see if we'd intervene before offering help. She told Lucas one story about when I was little and loved to color, keeping it light and age-appropriate, and not using it as an opportunity to guilt trip or reminisce about what she'd lost. By the end of the hour, Lucas was comfortable enough with her to wave goodbye, and my mother left with dignity even though I could see how much she wanted to stay longer, wanted more, wanted everything she'd missed. In the car afterward, James said he was impressed by how she'd handled it, that she'd shown real restraint and respect for our role as parents. I agreed, but said 1 good hour didn't erase years of bad behavior, that we needed to see consistency over time. Lucas fell asleep in his car seat, exhausted from the new experience, and I watched him in the rearview mirror and felt grateful that this version of my mother was the only one he'd ever know, that he'd never experienced the cruelty and control I'd grown up with. Dr. Chen called that evening to debrief and said she thought the meeting had gone well, that my mother had demonstrated genuine progress in respecting boundaries and deferring to our parental authority. She suggested we consider regular monthly visits if we felt comfortable, gradually increasing frequency if things continued to go well. Over the next 6 months, we established a rhythm of supervised visits every 3 weeks, my mother slowly becoming a familiar presence in Lucas's life. She never pushed for more than we offered, never questioned our parenting choices, never tried to undermine us or insert herself inappropriately. She brought small, appropriate gifts that she'd cleared with us first, followed our rules about sugar and screen time, asked before taking photos to share with relatives. The restraining order expired during this period, and we chose not to renew it, the legal boundary no longer necessary with the behavioral boundaries holding. My mother's Alzheimer's was progressing slowly, occasional moments of confusion or forgetfulness, but she was managing it with medication and cognitive exercises and seemed determined to stay sharp enough to enjoy whatever time she had with her Lucas started calling her grandma without prompting, would ask about her between visits, clearly forming an attachment to this gentle older woman who played with him and read him stories. Watching their relationship develop brought up complicated feelings. Joy that Lucas had this connection mixed with grief for what I'd missed as a child. Anger that it had taken my father's death, and an Alzheimer's diagnosis for my mother to finally do the work of change. James would find me crying sometimes after visits, and I'd try to explain that I was happy and sad simultaneously, grateful for what was but mourning what could have been if she'd done this work 20 years ago. He'd hold me and say that my feelings were valid, that reconciliation didn't erase history, that I could appreciate her current efforts while still carrying the weight of her past failures. Dr. Chen suggested we try an unsupervised visit after 9 months of consistent good behavior, just a few hours at our house with us present, but not actively monitoring every interaction. My mother was thrilled and terrified in equal measure, kept asking if there were rules she should know, what topics were off limits, whether she should bring. I told her to just be herself, the version of herself she'd been showing up as for the past months, and trust that we'd speak up if something felt wrong. The visit went smoothly, my mother helping Lucas with an art project while James and I made lunch, all of us eating together at our kitchen table like a normal family. There was a moment when Lucas spilled his juice and my mother automatically moved to clean it, before catching herself and looking to us for guidance. And I saw in that pause how hard she was working to respect our authority, to not fall back into the controlling grandmother role she might have defaulted. After lunch, Lucas wanted to show Grandma his room, and I followed them upstairs to supervise, but hung back in the doorway while my mother looked around at the nursery James and I had painted together, at the bookshelf full of stories we'd carefully chosen, at the photos of Lucas with our chosen family covering the walls. She said quietly, "You've built a beautiful life for him, a safe life. Thank you for letting me be a small part of it." There was genuine humility in her voice, acknowledgement that she was a guest in this life we'd created without her. And I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, a small piece of the anger I'd carried for so long releasing its grip. I told her she'd earned her place here by doing the work, that I'd had no guarantees she was capable of change, but she'd proven me wrong, and that meant something even if it didn't fix everything. As my mother's Alzheimer's progressed into the second year of our reconciliation, there were harder moments. She'd sometimes forget that James was my husband and refer to him as my boyfriend, or forget that we'd already discussed certain topics and bring them up again. Occasionally, she'd slip into her old patterns, starting to say something controlling or judgmental before catching herself and apologizing. The worst incident happened during a visit when she saw the birth control pills in my medicine cabinet and her face went dark, years of conditioning taking over before her conscious mind could stop it. She opened her mouth to say something, and I saw the war happening behind her eyes, old beliefs battling new understanding. And then she closed her mouth and walked away. She called me that night crying, apologizing for even the momentary reaction, saying she was still working on reprogramming decades of toxic thinking, and sometimes it bubbled up despite her best efforts. I told her I appreciated the apology, but needed to know it wouldn't happen in front of Lucas, that I wouldn't expose him to judgment about our family planning choices even accidentally. She promised she'd be more careful, suggested maybe we do visits outside our home for a while, so she wasn't exposed to things that might trigger her old patterns. It was a reasonable suggestion, and showed self-awareness about her limitations, so we agreed to meet at parks and museums and Dr. Chen's office for the next few months until she felt more stable. James said later that he was impressed by how she'd handled her own backslide, that taking responsibility and suggesting a protective measure showed real growth. I agreed, but said I'd always be watching for signs of regression, that one of the costs of her past behavior was my permanent vigilance about her current behavior. Lucas turned 3 during the second year of reconciliation, and my mother asked if she could throw him a birthday party. Nothing big, just her and Patricia and Aunt Marie and a few of James's family members. It would be the first time she'd hosted anything for us, the first time she'd be in the role of grandmother publicly with our approval. I was nervous about it, but agreed, figuring it was a test of whether she could handle a larger family gathering without reverting to her old controlling ways. She rented a room at a community center and decorated it with Lucas's current obsession, dinosaurs, and made food she'd checked with us first to ensure it met our dietary preferences. When we arrived, she greeted James warmly and thanked us for trusting her with this, And I saw Patricia look surprised at how deferential my mother was being, how different from the domineering woman she'd been before. The party was actually lovely, my mother facilitating rather than controlling, making sure Lucas was having fun rather than staging perfect photos for social media. She introduced James's parents to her sisters without any awkwardness, acknowledging that they'd been there for us when she hadn't. When Lucas asked her to play a game with him, she got down on the floor in her nice clothes and played without worrying about her dignity or what people thought. At one point, Aunt Marie pulled me aside and said she couldn't believe this was the same woman who'd cursed me in the parking lot at my father's funeral, that the change was so dramatic it was almost disorienting. I told her that facing death and dementia had apparently been the wake-up call my mother needed, that I wished it hadn't taken something so extreme, but I was grateful for the change even if it came too late to fix our relationship completely. Toward the end of the party, my mother asked if she could say something to everyone. I tensed immediately, worried she was about to make a scene or say something inappropriate, but James squeezed my hand and nodded for her to go ahead. My mother stood and said simply that she wanted to thank us for giving her a second chance she didn't deserve, that she'd lost years with her daughter and her grandson through her own stubbornness and cruelty, and that getting to be here today celebrating Lucas's 3rd birthday was a gift she'd never take for granted. She said she knew she couldn't undo the past, but she was committed to being better in whatever future she had left, and that she hoped Lucas would grow up knowing he was loved without conditions by all his family. It was a short speech, but it acknowledged everything that needed acknowledging without being maudlin or asking for sympathy, and several people had tears in their eyes when she finished, including me. After the party, driving home with Lucas asleep in the back seat, James asked how I was feeling about it. I told him I felt cautiously at peace, that my mother had shown consistent changed behavior for almost 2 years now, that while our relationship would never be what I'd wanted as a child, it had become something workable in the present. I said I'd stopped hoping for her to be a different person and started accepting who she actually was. Someone who'd done terrible harm, but was genuinely trying to do better. And that acceptance felt like its own kind of. James asked if I thought I'd forgive her completely someday, and I said I didn't know if complete forgiveness was possible or even necessary. That what mattered more was that we'd found a way to coexist that didn't require me to sacrifice my safety or my boundaries. Lucas was 4.5 when my mother's Alzheimer's took a sharper turn for the. She started having trouble remembering recent conversations, would tell us the same stories multiple times in a single visit, occasionally forgot Lucas's name, and called him by my childhood nickname for. We had to adjust our visits to be shorter and more structured, and I started bringing a notebook to write down important things she said so I could remind her later without making her feel embarrassed about. There were still good days when she was sharp and present, but the bad days were becoming more frequent. Her neurologist said she had maybe 2 more years of living independently before she'd need full-time care, and the clock on her remaining cognitive function was ticking louder with each passing. One evening during a visit, my mother looked at me with sudden clarity and said she needed to tell me something while she still could. She said she'd been writing letters for Lucas to receive as he got older. Letters for his 10th birthday, his 16th, his 21st, his wedding day if he had. She'd been working on them for the past year with help from her therapist, trying to leave him something of value beyond the limited memories he'd have of. She asked if I'd keep them safe and give them to him at the appropriate times, and I promised I would. She also gave me a letter addressed to me, sealed, and said I could read it now, or save it for after she was gone, whatever I thought I could handle. I tucked it into my purse and told her I'd read it when I was ready, not sure if that would be tomorrow or 10 years from now. I read the letter that night after Lucas was asleep, sitting on our back porch with a glass of wine and my heart pounding. My mother's handwriting was shaky but legible, and the letter was 5 pages long. She detailed specific moments she regretted from my childhood, things I'd forgotten or buried that she'd been carrying guilt about for decades. She acknowledged that the birth control incident wasn't an isolated event, but the culmination of years of controlling behavior, that she'd been crushing my spirit slowly long before that final break. She wrote about watching me build a life without her, and feeling proud and devastated simultaneously. Proud that I'd had the strength to leave, but devastated by what she'd lost through her own actions. She said that loving me had always been easy, but respecting me as a separate person with her own choices had been impossibly hard until she'd lost me completely and realized that control wasn't love at all.